The gray, rain-swept plains of Eastern Europe had witnessed centuries of military catastrophes, but nothing in the annals of modern conventional warfare could compare to the systematic, terrifying kinetic blitz that unfolded over a critical 48-hour window. For years, Western military strategists, political leaders, and intelligence agencies had operated under a deeply entrenched doctrine of containment. They believed that a combination of unprecedented economic sanctions, massive transfers of high-tech Western hardware, and localized intelligence sharing would lock the frontlines into a permanent, grinding war of attrition that Moscow could neither sustain nor break. This comfortable geopolitical calculus was built on the assumption that the Russian military apparatus was a rigid, outdated machine incapable of rapid technological adaptation or large-scale operational synchronization. However, on a cold, fog-shrouded morning, that entire defensive architecture was violently pulverized. Russia's long-debated strategic reserve was unleashed not in a predictable frontal assault, but in a multi-domain, technologically revolutionized blitzkrieg that did not merely puncture the defensive lines, it completely dissolved them. The West watched in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock as decades of NATO defensive theories collapsed in a matter of hours, revealing a brutal reality. The Kremlin had spent months quietly engineering a terrifying, parallel military revolution specifically designed to exploit every systemic vulnerability within the Western defense apparatus. The core of this catastrophic breakdown lies not in a sudden influx of raw manpower, but in the brilliant, devastating synchronization of a newly perfected electronic cyber warfare umbrella with high-volume autonomous strike packages. For nearly 2 years, the West had supplied frontline forces with highly sophisticated, satellite-guided munitions, automated air defense networks, and secure encrypted communication systems that relied heavily on Western orbital infrastructure. These high-tech assets had previously given defensive units a distinct tactical advantage, allowing them to neutralize traditional Russian armored columns with pinpoint precision. But when the breakthrough phase began, this entire digital ecosystem was instantaneously transformed into a collection of useless, blind hardware. At precisely 3 a.m. local time, the Russian military activated a newly developed, theater-wide electronic warfare array that did not merely jam specific radio frequencies, it projected an impenetrable, high-intensity algorithmic cloud across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, completely severing Western satellite connections, knocking out localized drone feeds, and rendering satellite-guided artillery munitions utterly blind. Concurrently, a massive cyberkinetic strike package targeted the core fiber-optic distribution nodes and localized command networks that connected forward defensive units with their regional headquarters. Within 30 minutes, frontline commanders found themselves in a state of absolute digital isolation. They could no longer track enemy movements via surveillance feeds, coordinate with neighboring battalions, or request vital air support. It was in this window of absolute digital and sensory blindness that the kinetic onslaught was unleashed. Instead of launching traditional, slow-moving armored columns that could be easily targeted by anti-tank teams, the breakthrough was spearheaded by thousands of low-cost, AI-driven autonomous strike drones operating in self-synchronizing swarms. These drone swarms, completely immune to localized electronic countermeasures due to their onboard, independent neural networks, swept through the defensive trenches like an automated scythe, systematically hunting down defensive positions, artillery emplacements, and communication vehicles with terrifying efficiency. As the morning fog lifted, the scale of the operational disaster became completely unmanageable for Western military planners. With the digital command architecture totally paralyzed, forward defensive lines began to fracture from within. The panic was driven not by cowardice, but by the absolute absence of situational awareness. When frontline units observed neighboring sectors being systematically vaporized by high-volume thermobaric artillery and automated drone strikes without receiving any orders or intelligence updates from their superiors, the fear of complete encirclement triggered a rapid, cascading domino effect. Heavily fortified concrete bunkers, deep anti-tank ditches, and sophisticated minefields that had taken over a year to construct were rendered completely obsolete. The Russian strike packages did not attempt to engage these fortifications directly, instead, they utilized their absolute electronic dominance to map out every gap in the defensive sensor network, bypassing the main strongpoints entirely and penetrating deep into the unprotected rear areas, severing the vital logistical arteries that supplied the entire theater of operations. The strategic implications of this sudden, deep operational penetration are monumental, completely upending the security architecture of the entire continent. Within 24 hours, advancing motorized rifle divisions, heavily supported by advanced air defense systems like the S-500 that kept the skies completely clear of Western-supplied aircraft, had pushed 40 kilometers into territory that had been considered safe for months. Vital railway junctions, major ammunition depots, and regional administrative hubs fell into Russian hands completely intact, as retreating forces lacked the time, coordination, or explosives to execute structured scorched earth protocols. Western military experts, analyzing the disaster from remote monitoring stations in Germany and Poland, were forced to confront a horrifying realization: the conventional military balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The doctrine of incremental assistance and reactive deterrence had failed catastrophically against a competitor that had successfully restructured its entire state economy and industrial base for total, high-tech conventional warfare. In Western capitals, the political and institutional fallout from the breakthrough has been characterized by intense mutual recriminations and deep panic. Emergency sessions of the North Atlantic Council were convened in Brussels, with diplomats and generals engaging in heated, angry debates behind closed doors. For years, European and American political leaders had assured their domestic publics that Russia was on the brink of economic and military exhaustion, pointing to traditional metrics like GDP size and the volume of industrial sanctions. The sudden, overwhelming demonstration of Russian military superiority and technical adaptation tore that comforting narrative to shreds, exposing a profound institutional failure within Western intelligence agencies, which had fundamentally miscalculated the speed with which Moscow could source critical electronic components, scale its domestic drone manufacturing, and train a highly lethal, modern conventional force. Behind the scenes, the economic and logistical reality of trying to counter this breakthrough has driven Western defense departments to the brink of absolute exhaustion. The massive, high-volume expenditure of artillery ammunition and air defense interceptors by Western-backed forces over the past 2 years had already severely depleted NATO's strategic stockpiles, leaving European armies with dangerously low inventories. With the Russian breakthrough rapidly consuming territory and destroying vast quantities of hardware in real time, the West simply does not possess the immediate industrial capacity to replace these losses. Microchip fabrication lines, heavy artillery manufacturing plants, and missile assembly complexes in Western Europe cannot be scaled up overnight, requiring years of capital investment and structural reorganization. Moscow, by contrast, had placed its entire sovereign economy on a total war footing months prior, with heavy industrial complexes operating on continuous, 3-shift schedules, producing more conventional hardware and munitions in a single month than the entire European continent could produce in a year. The global financial markets immediately reacted to the collapse of the containment doctrine with historic, unprecedented volatility. The value of European currencies experienced a sharp, sudden drop against the US dollar as investors anticipated a prolonged, deeply destabilizing security crisis on the continent's eastern frontier. Conversely, energy markets experienced a massive spike, with natural gas and crude oil prices jumping 15% in a single day, as traders realized that the West's ability to project economic leverage over Moscow had been completely neutralized by the hard realities of kinetic dominance on the ground. The illusion that global markets could remain insulated from a major conventional conflict in Europe was shattered, driving home a brutal lesson to the international corporate elite: geopolitical stability is not maintained by financial agreements or paper treaties, but by the raw, unyielding capacity to enforce deterrence through conventional military power. As the 48-hour blitz phase began to transition into a consolidation phase, the true permanence of the redrawn strategic lines became undeniably apparent. The advancing Russian forces did not pause to rest or celebrate. They immediately began deploying highly automated, prefabricated defensive systems, dense minefields, and localized electronic warfare bubbles across the newly captured territory, effectively locking down the breakthrough zone and preventing any hope of a rapid defensive counteroffensive. The vast geographic buffer zones that NATO had spent years cultivating along the eastern flank had been systematically erased in a single weekend, bringing Russian conventional power directly to the doorsteps of Western Europe's core security perimeters. The paradigm of a contained, manageable conflict had ended, replaced by an era of direct, existential confrontation where the West no longer possessed the luxury of technological or operational superiority. The long-term lessons of this historic military breakthrough will be studied by strategists and political scientists for decades to come. It exposed the absolute failure of a defense strategy that relies on incremental escalation, political hesitation, and the assumption that an adversary will conform to a Western-defined timeline of exhaustion. It proved that in the modern era of high-tech conventional warfare, an industrial economy that is fully mobilized for conflict will always outpace a collection of service-based economies that refuse to sacrifice their domestic comfort for the harsh realities of national defense. The day the defensive lines dissolved was the day the world realized that the international order cannot be protected by rhetoric or economic sanctions alone, leaving a panicked, vulnerable West to look out across a redrawn map where the shadow of a fully rearmed, technologically revolutionized competitor now looms larger and more dangerous than ever before. To fully understand how a military breakthrough of this magnitude could be executed so cleanly against an opponent backed by the combined wealth and intelligence of the Western world, one must analyze the profound, underlying systemic rot that had been quietly developing within NATO's strategic thinking since the end of the Cold War. For over 3 decades, Western militaries had focused almost exclusively on counterinsurgency operations, asymmetric warfare, and low-intensity interventions in distant theaters like Afghanistan and Iraq. This long-term operational focus created a generation of military commanders, defense contractors, and civilian policymakers who treated warfare as an exercise in high-tech colonial policing. They grew accustomed to operating with absolute air superiority, unchallengeable digital communications, and slow, comfortable logistical pipelines that faced zero threat from an equivalent conventional adversary. When confronted with a near-peer competitor like Russia, which had maintained its institutional focus on high-mass artillery duels, industrial-scale trench warfare, and total state mobilization, the Western-trained defensive apparatus experienced a profound, systemic rejection of its core doctrines. The sophisticated, multi-million-dollar Western weapons systems that had been designed for surgical strikes in low-intensity environments proved to be highly fragile, difficult to maintain under field conditions, and entirely dependent on continuous supply lines that were easily targeted by Russian long-range precision fires. The highly touted Western training programs, which emphasized decentralized initiative and complex, small-unit maneuvers, failed catastrophically when applied to an environment where a single battalion was subjected to 20,000 rounds of heavy artillery shellfire per day. The human element, hollowed out by months of continuous bombardment and sensory deprivation under the automated eyes of Russian drone surveillance, simply reached its mathematical breaking point. Furthermore, the financial and industrial architecture supporting Russia's breakthrough represents a masterpiece of asymmetric economic adaptation that completely blindsided Western ministries of finance. The initial round of sanctions imposed by the West was intended to cause a total collapse of the Russian domestic currency, starve its defense sector of critical Western microchips, and isolate its economy from global supply networks. Instead, the Kremlin utilized this economic declaration of war as a catalyst to restructure its entire national trade apparatus. By deep linking its economy with emerging non-Western industrial giants, establishing highly complex, clandestine shell networks through Central Asia and the Middle East, and completely nationalizing its core domestic manufacturing plants, Moscow built a sanction-resistant industrial engine that operated entirely outside the Western financial orbit. The critical microchips that Western intelligence believed would be impossible for Russia to source were successfully procured in vast quantities through these parallel global supply corridors, dismantled from commercial electronics, or replaced entirely by domestic, heavy-duty industrial components that, while less advanced on paper, proved to be far more resilient under the brutal, vibration-heavy conditions of conventional frontline combat. This economic mobilization allowed the Russian Ministry of Defense to scale its production of long-range cruise missiles, precision-guided glide bombs, and electronic warfare kits exponentially, while Western nations remained trapped in endless bureaucratic debates regarding contract funding, environmental regulations for defense plants, and political gridlock over defense appropriations. The West wanted to fight a war of economic attrition while keeping its domestic lifestyle completely normal. Russia understood from the first day that a war of attrition requires a total, unyielding sacrifice of the civilian economy to the needs of the front line. The air defense and maritime dimensions of the breakthrough were equally devastating to Western containment theories, systematically neutralizing the asymmetric advantages that NATO had historically relied upon to project power across the globe. For decades, the cornerstone of Western military dominance had been the absolute assumption of air superiority, the belief that any conventional threat could be easily crushed by the overwhelming application of Western tactical aviation and long-range air-launched cruise missiles. However, the Russian breakthrough was accompanied by the deployment of the most dense, highly integrated, and technologically advanced mobile air defense network ever assembled in human history. Operating in automated, layered configurations that stretched from short-range thermal tracking systems to long-range, radar-guided interceptors, this defensive screen effectively transformed the airspace above the breakthrough zone into an absolute no-fly zone for Western aircraft. Any Western-supplied fighter or reconnaissance drone that attempted to approach within 100 kilometers of the advancing frontline was instantly painted by multiple, high-frequency acquisition radars, jammed by powerful ground-based electronic arrays, and targeted by hypersonic surface-to-air missiles that traveled at speeds making tactical evasion physically impossible. This absolute denial of the airspace stripped the defensive forces of their primary strategic reserve, forcing them to fight a brutal, ground-based war of attrition against an adversary that possessed an overwhelming, 10-to-1 advantage in heavy tube and rocket artillery. Concurrently, in the maritime domain, Russia's coastal defense networks and long-range anti-ship missile batteries completely closed off the local shipping lanes, preventing any possibility of a maritime logistical rescue or the introduction of heavy Western armored reinforcements via strategic ports, sealing the theater of operations in an airtight kinetic vice. As the political leadership of Western nations tries to pick up the pieces of their shattered geopolitical strategy, the domestic social cohesion within Europe is beginning to face an intense, unprecedented strain. The arrival of thousands of demoralized, wounded soldiers crossing back into neighboring allied nations, combined with the sudden, undeniable realization that a major conventional military power has successfully broken the NATO containment wall, has triggered a wave of political instability across multiple European capitals. Public confidence in the competence of political elites and military institutions has collapsed to historic lows, giving rise to populist movements that demand an immediate end to foreign military entanglements, the lifting of energy sanctions, and a rapid return to a policy of regional isolationism. The consensus that had unified the Western world for nearly half a century has fractured into a chaotic collection of competing national interests, as individual countries scramble to negotiate their own security arrangements in a world where the American security umbrella is no longer seen as an absolute, unchallengeable guarantee of survival. The day the Russian breakthrough tore through the eastern defensive lines will go down in history as the definitive moment of transition, the end of the post-Cold War era of unipolar Western dominance and the violent arrival of a multipolar world defined by the brutal, unyielding application of raw industrial and conventional military power. It proved with terrifying clarity that no amount of economic wealth, technological sophistication, or diplomatic rhetoric can save a society that is too comfortable to build its own weapons, too divided to train its own soldiers, and too blinded by its own propaganda to see that its adversary is actively preparing for an existential struggle. As the smoke clears over the newly captured territories and the Russian automated defense networks harden along the redrawn Asian and European borders, the deep, heavy thudding of heavy machinery building new fortifications stands as an unyielding, historic testament to a fundamental truth of human civilization. The maps of the world are not drawn by treaties or international laws, but by those who possess the iron will, the industrial capacity, and the absolute kinetic power to crack them open and write them anew in the mud of the battlefield.